So for those who don't know me, I am Dana Wolff-Hughes. I am a program officer in the Division of Cancer Control and Population Sciences within the Epidemiology and Genomics Research Program in the Risk Factor Assessment Branch, which I know is a mouthful. But I want to sort of thread the needle today about some of the things that previous presenters have talked about and bring in more of the epidemiological and surveillance lens with regards to digital health technologies. So you all know this, technology is ubiquitous. We have sensors to measure just about everything, tons of data, and it's posing tremendous opportunities to advance science across disciplines, whether it be mental health related issues, substance abuse, cancer. There's tons of opportunity, but there are also challenges. These challenges are multidisciplinary, and they're going to be best solved by bridging communities. And I'm hoping that that comes through in my talk today. And in particular, what we really need to think about is at what point do we integrate these technologies into our existing ecosystem, not just the research ecosystem, but the clinical ecosystem. And I think this is really important when we talk about things like uptake and use and engagement with the technologies, not just by providers, but by patients. And so there are questions like how and when can we include these technologies? What makes sense in the different contexts for which they're being deployed, clinical versus epi versus surveillance? And so I think there are a few things that are, in my sort of view, are maybe easier wins to think about, where we can think about for epi and surveillance. And in particular is fit for purpose digital health technologies. Digital Medicine Society has done a lot of this with their V3 framework, which is what is up here on the slide. But a lot of times I think I get the question of, why is this important? This isn't really hot, sexy stuff to do, this validation work. And if you all sort of saw earlier this week with the FDA panel on pulse oximeters, there was a nice sort of report out in STAT, and that article I highly recommend people to read. It said, for FDA guidelines for medical devices, as little as 10 subjects are needed for approval, of which 2 of those 10 or 15% have to be a person of color. On top of that, what they also sort of noticed is that the testing environments for which these devices are done actually don't mirror the real world sort of applications in places where they're being deployed. So in this case, what they found was with the pulse oximeters, they were warming the subject's hands. They were blocking ambient light. All this relates to the issues that we've seen now where the pulse oximeters are heavily biased. These are for medical devices though. And a lot of the work that I do is actually not with medical devices. They're what the FDA calls general wellness devices. So that's your Fitbits, your other devices that are not classified as medical devices. And it's important for validation there too. One example I like to use is I have a colleague at an academic institution working with endometrial cancer patients. And her study was shut down by a DSMB for several months because there was an algorithm change that came up in a commercial wearable device that forced the inclusion of heart rate. Well, why is that important? Well, these endometrial cancer patients are on beta blockers and they have blunted heart rates and blunted response to exercise. And the DSMB was concerned that by moving forward with the protocol, which was an intervention to increase activity, that they may cause an adverse event in these participants. So one of the things I've been working on, for those who may be interested, is a way, at least from the NIH perspective, to start addressing this. And this is a notice of special interest that is focused on validation of digital health and AI tools across contexts, whether that's epi, clinical, or intervention research. The other big thing that I've been really harping on is the need for standards and harmonization. And so this slide here is from a National Academies report from a couple years ago focused on surveillance of physical activity. And what you can see here is that they have different strategies in here, including children. They have integrating of a standard sort of physical activity sign. What that really means is in the EHR. They're also wanting to move towards including wearable devices in the EHR. And a lot of EHRs now have the capability of integrating these wearables. But what I hear a lot of times is we have the capability, we're not using it because we don't know what to do with this data, and in particular, what measures to use and how to interpret. And this is something that the Office of the National Coordinator of Health IT at HHS has sort of harped on too, and they have this report on precision medicine. And what they say down here is that, they tackled heart rate and some other vital signs, but they didn't do anything with sleep and physical activity because there's a need for standards in the area. And from my lens, at least on the physical activity side, what we've seen is different measures, and we've seen some of this today with movelets and, historically too, I'll say cut point methods have traditionally been used. And what you can see here is those cut points result in wildly different estimates of activity. And in this case, this is percentage of individuals meeting the physical activity guidelines for Americans, which is 150 minutes per week of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And part of the difference here that's occurring is the populations for which these algorithms were developed, whether it be kids or older adults. But a big part of it too is just the error across these algorithms and who they were testing and the activities for which they were validating. So since moving back to NCI, I've taken over for Rick Troiano, who has done a lot with the physical activity surveillance space, in particular with NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And what NHANES did for 2011-2014 is use MIMS, which is Monitor Independent Movement Summary Units. This is an algorithm developed by Stephen Antilli and Dinesh John at Northeastern. And just briefly, this algorithm is an alternative to cut point methods. And what it does is it takes different raw accelerometer data and filters it out and enables you to interpolate and harmonize at the sampling rate, as well as different ranges of Gs from the device. And so this is a way to harmonize across devices that provide raw acceleration data. So this is not proprietary metric device data. You would have to have the raw accelerometer data from the device, which is what we had in NHANES with the actigraph. This is a great metric. This data is available on the NHANES site and can be downloaded. It's released in our minute, hour, day level MIMS unit. We took that data and we also created population reference curves. We've done this now twice. The first on the left is with the 2003-2006 data. This was a hip-worn actigraph device that was uniaxial. On the right is the new 2011, and I say new because it was only released last year, 2011 to 2014 NHANES data. And what this allows us to do is to place people relative to others in the US population. So we're using a harmonized metric and a way to compare across populations in the US. Now, another way to think about sort of how we get to harmonization and standardization is ontologies. And prior to coming to NCI, I was in the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences research at NIH, and some of the work being done there is focused on ontologies in behavioral and social sciences. And recently, the past year, they had a National Academies on this, which is resulting in a funding opportunity that may come out sometime in the next year, focused on funding in FY24. And the goal here is to take the developments and the work that's being done more broadly in biomedical ontology development and specifically apply it to behavioral and social sciences research and the issues there. There's a real lack of actual ontology work being done. And so the goal here would be to have a coordination and dissemination center that sort of facilitates collaboration across a wider network, as well as individual sort of traditional UO1 cooperative agreement research projects focused specifically on topics of behavioral social sciences and developing ontologies in that area, whether it's affect, whether it's physical activity or sleep. Now, the other thing that I have been thinking about that builds upon sort of Jesse Lynn's earlier presentation about the DBDP is where we go more broadly. I don't see, at least from a physical activity lens with proprietary metrics, as ever being able to really get at a true standard. And so where I see this sort of landing is ability to harmonize. And for those who may be aware of previous work, there was the PROMISE initiative, which is the patient-reported outcomes measurement information system. And what they did with that initiative was take, in that case, commonly used PRO measures that were across different scales and different sort of validated instruments, primarily survey, and they crosswalked them to be able to compare between two and say, okay, these are somewhat similar. If you go to one provider or another and they use different scales, how can we compare the two? I see the same thing as being necessary in the digital health space. And so to expand upon sort of Jesse Lynn's sort of earlier presentation with the exploration, I think we're doing a lot of that now, but then taking it a step further and actually moving towards crosswalking those different digital biomarkers, as well as comparing it to other survey measures as well. And this is important from my perspective because CMS is already moving in this direction with their digital quality measures and taking those digital quality measures and integrating them within the learning health system. And so being able to harmonize and move forward these really impactful measures so that you can get regulatory sort of buy-in as well as potential for reimbursement. That's where I think we need to start thinking about going. But that comes back to sort of something I mentioned earlier, which is we have the capabilities now in the EHR, but the common retort is we don't know what to do with all this data. We don't want all of this data. So the last thing I sort of wanted to throw out for you all to think about that's been sort of rummaging in my head for the past few months is what data do we need and when do we need it? And this notion of what I'm calling minimal viable assessment. So if you look at this as different data streams, maybe even different time scales, right now we're in a phase where we want all the data. And I'm not saying at all that we don't want all the data because we're going to need all the data to get to this, right? But we need to start thinking about what is the minimum that we need and how do we measure that? What are the approaches necessary? Maybe we only need, 2 time windows of measurement. Maybe we only need 2 data streams. That's going to, at least in my opinion, help us move towards better adoption of these metrics within the EHR system. And in particular, I think it's going to vary across disease contexts, behaviors, et cetera. But I think there are specific questions we can start thinking about. So within this notion of MVA is how many monitoring days do you need from a device? And so this was done several years ago and compared sort of the monitoring protocols. And it's really all over the map. And even still, if you look in the literature, some say you need 3 days, you need to include a weekend day because weekends are so vastly different from weekdays. Well, that's actually really not the case at a population level for EPI. So when we sort of take the NHANES data and we sort of simulate it and we run it through, we actually find that you can take one random day and you can estimate habitual physical activity. And what you can see on the left is when you force weekend days, you actually introduce a whole lot of error. Now, again, this is at population level. individual, it may be important to have that weekend day, but we really need to start figuring out when we delineate the two and what that means for how we sort of handle our data, what data is needed, and when. So just to sort of wrap up, moving forward, what do we really need? I think we need to continue developing and tailoring new and existing approaches for digital biomarkers. We need harmonization and standards. Others today have hinted at this and pointed towards this. We really need to understand engagement, even defining what do we mean by engagement with these devices. That's really important. I'll say for the students, I think this is a wide open area of engagement and how we get to better engagement, defining it, how we model it. And then we need rigor and reproducibility. How do we understand similarities, differences across behaviors, contexts, populations, health conditions? So with that, I'll sort of end and thank you all for having me.